Okay, so thank you to everyone. Thank you, Jorge. Thank you to Nuria for inviting me to present, and welcome to everyone. I don't normally give trigger warnings, but I want to say that I'm aware that many of us are directly and indirectly impacted by the current horror that's occurring in the Middle East. So I just wanted to say that if you feel that it's all too much with this topic this evening, don't forget it is videoed. And you can watch it again at some other time if you don't feel up to it at any time during my presentation. I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land, and today I have the absolute privilege of being on Ngunnawal country. So my workshop, as Jorge said, aims to give insight and share knowledge about working with women from refugee background who are impacted by intimate partner violence. And this is a highly prevalent public health problem and a violation of human rights. It's also an issue that you as practitioners must be encountering, even if sometimes you're not aware of it. So in this presentation, I'm going to cover prevalence and manifestations of IPV and risk and protective factors for women from refugee background, and issues about screening and assessment, including safety. And I'm going to discuss the empirically supported interventions. And I'm going to focus on women survivors, although in the past I've presented on the topic of male perpetrators and I've written about male victims. And when I'm referring to women, I mean all who identify as women. And I'm targeting in this presentation you, the counsellors and clinicians and social workers and advocates, but I hope it's okay that I'm going to refer to you all as counsellors. So just to familiarise you with the extent of the problem in Australia in the general population, these data are from ABS Personal Safety Survey and ANROSE and Our Watch, but 1 in 4 women experience violence by an intimate partner in Australia. You know, 1 woman every week is murdered by her partner or ex-partner, and note many of those are from migrant background. When when you read the news stories, you'll see that I'm not sure the data are, but it seems pretty common. Australian women are likely to experience physical and sexual violence in their home, more likely to experience physical and sexual violence in their own home at the hands of a male partner or ex-partner. And almost 10 women a day are hospitalised for assault injuries perpetrated by a spouse or a domestic partner. And these data don't even include all the women on psychiatric wards who've experienced IPV that's associated with mental illness. So in general populations, IPV is a significant contributor to the overall burden of disease, and this is due largely to the high prevalence of depressive and anxiety disorders and substance abuse. Our study that was published in JAMA included a representative sample of 4,451 women, and it showed that gender-based violence, and that included IPV, sexual assault, rape and stalking, was strongly associated with common mental disorders and PTSD, and women who experienced gender-based violence had more severe disorders and comorbidity with other mental disorders, increased rates of physical illness, and reported higher rates of past suicide attempt. An intersectional perspective assists with understanding IPV more holistically. So that is to understand the different forms of oppression that intersect with gender to make her risk and her recovery profile different. So an intersectional approach calls attention to the importance of race or ethnicity, gender, and other forms of marginalisation, including being a refugee, that will shape a person's identity. And I just urge you to read or listen to the veritable leader of the intersectionality field, Kimberly Crenshaw. And I want to cover early in the presentation the various ways that relationship aggression is enacted. And these include physical violence, sexual violence, financial abuse, psychological and emotional abuse, including gaslighting, which I'm going to speak a little bit more about in a minute, social abuse, cyber abuse, and spiritual abuse, and that includes the use of religious beliefs or practices to control someone's behaviour or movement. So we need to be really easily able to recognise, on the lookout to recognise coercive control, which is also known as internet terrorism. Coercive control includes isolating, depriving her of basic needs, monitoring her via online communication tools or spyware, depriving her of access to support services, repeatedly putting her down, humiliating, degrading, and dehumanizing her, and controlling finances, making threats or intimidating her, jealousy, and gaslighting. Now, gaslighting serves to undermine someone's confidence in their judgment and can contribute to self-blame. So you can imagine how that's used very effectively by and to the full advantage of an abuser. And as Heather Nancarrow, who was CEO of ANROS, used to point out, don't forget that physical violence can also occur within the context of a coercive controlling behaviour. So I also want you to think about how these identified global risk factors for IPV might be more pronounced or increase the risk for people from refugee background. So the ones I think may be particularly relevant to heightening the risk in Australia are low socioeconomic status and poverty, attitudes supporting abuse of the female partner and supporting gender inequality, the woman working while her partner doesn't, not choosing your own spouse, alcohol abuse and the perpetrator, male behaviours that are commonly associated with traditional masculinity, and young age. And that's in the victim survivor. IPV is in fact a distinctive form of trauma. It's unique because it's rarely a single event, such as being in a car accident, and it occurs within a relationship that's supposed to be characterised by trust and safety and love and security. It's not assumed to be like a war zone. And IPV also occurs in a context where there's this prevailing shame and blame and silencing occurring. Attention's been given to measuring and treating complex PTSD in cases of IPV, and CPTSD is characterised by prolonged and repeated incidents over a period of time, as is often the nature of a violent interpersonal relationship. And imagine, however, how complex trauma can be for a woman from refugee background who may have experienced multiple co-occurring forms of trauma because of war and conflict, loss of family members, as well as violence from her intimate partner. And although I'm not focusing on perpetrators, it's really important to consider issues around torture and trauma in male partners when you're working with women survivors from refugee background. So just quickly, our analysis demonstrated a positive path from exposure to torture to the perpetration of IPV in men, and that path was through mental disturbance. But this I want to stress. There was a high prevalence of IPV perpetration in a study of 889 men that was not associated with torture. So that suggested that there were other factors such as persisting patriarchal attitudes and so on that contributed to that risk for IPV. And it appears that women from conflict-affected background may experience IPV at a higher rate and experience greater associated mental health impacts. The analysis from our Watch cohort studies shown higher rates of intimate partner violence, that is for Australian-born women consistent with the national average, but higher for refugee background women residing here. So for example, our analysis of 1,335 women using the comprehensive WHO measure for domestic violence revealed 43.4% of refugee women reported physical or psychological IPV from the most recent or current partner, compared to 25.9% of Australian-born women. And the rates were similar at follow-up, now over 5 time points, with a slight attrition in the refugee cohort. It was concerning that intimate partner violence was strongly associated with depressive disorder amongst the women in the Watch study. 63% of women from conflict-affected backgrounds and 20% of women born in the host nation who reported psychological IPV had depressive disorder, and the rates were much higher in both groups if there was co-occurring physical and psychological IPV. I want to mention bride price because it exemplifies another prevalent gendered variable that may be relevant to refugee women experiencing IPV. Up until recently, measures for financial stress and poverty and trauma have not included bride price. But bride price or dowry appears to be a strong risk factor for IPV and associated trauma and distress in low medium income countries and amongst refugees living in high income countries, although the evidence base for that is weaker. There's not enough research yet. Our study of 1,672 women in Timor-Leste found that bride price was indeed a strong, had a strong association with IPV. I want to discuss now some evidence from our WATCH cohort study that's identified the protective factors for women at risk of IPV. Understanding protective factors may help to shape how you support women attending your services and what you focus on if you're advocating for women from refugee background, as well as who might be more at risk in the absence of those factors. So in our latent class analysis, we found there were three groups of that looked like this. There was one who had no or limited IPV, two had a larger group that had IPV that changed unevenly in type, that's physical or psychological abuse and in reporting over time. And then there was the combined IPV group, which was women who reported physical and psychological abuse on repeated occasions, and they'd all transitioned to this combined category by the third time point. Basically, that was the highest risk group. And you can see that the higher rates of IPV among refugee women are grouped more predominantly in a changing IPV group, and that the highest risk groups, the most severe, were about the same size in both the refugee and the Australian-born women. And so for the refugee women, what were the protective factors? The protective factors for the refugee background women associated with the changing IPV group or the combined groups together compared to the no or limited IPV were older age, having fewer children, having a better partner relationship and less partner trauma events. And that included his exposure to war and conflict traumas. For the combined IPV group only, that's the smaller and more severe group, the protective factors for women were being in a couple, and that may indicate that the women at higher risk had left the relationship or that they would no longer consider themselves part of a couple. And having fewer living difficulties. And the living difficulties checklist includes things such as communication difficulties, discrimination, separation from family, worries about family back at home, and employment stress. And our study, I guess, demonstrates why we need to understand protective factors as well, as risk factors for diverse populations, and the importance of including protective factors that are relational, about family and about friendships and partnerships, as well as structural factors like norms and values and economic parity in both refugee background and Australian-born. So now with that background in mind, I'm going to just discuss interventions. So counsellors need to be prepared to conduct screening and be able to work therapeutically with women. The contemporary and ideal IPV model that you're working within is this integrated multi-service approach. And that model prioritises holding perpetrators accountable and aiding victim survivors. The model emphasises partnerships between domestic violence services, police and courts, and trauma services and schools and so on. And ideally, the aim is to work together toward behaviour change for perpetrators and to support the safety, welfare and autonomy for the victim survivor, which we're focusing on today. A good outcome from this model, apart from keeping the woman safe, of course, is that she doesn't have to tell her story over and over again to different service providers, and that we're all working together to support her. And in the refugee field, of course, it's important that counsellors are women where possible, and of course that they can speak the same language is also really advantageous. Women are less likely to disclose and more likely to feel shame and humiliation if the counsellor is a male or if there's an interpreter involved. So let's focus on screening. Should you routinely screen all women? This is a debate in the field. And this section on screening, as well as how to respond and interventions, are informed by the work of Nathan Beale in a recently published book. And I've adapted this for the refugee context, but the reference is on the slide and I really highly recommend it. So he reminds us that clients who are experiencing IPV do not always seek assistance directly for it. That is, they may present with other issues, and women may not spontaneously disclose IPV, or they don't recognise the abuse as IPV. So women may feel ashamed and embarrassed, or even feel fear being judged and blamed. So consider that the role that tradition and gendered worldviews have on how women internalise blame. She may also be justifiably concerned that the disclosure could lead to an escalation of the abuse. And indeed, that's an absolutely real fear, because women are at greatest risk of dying when they seek help or leave. And so you need to be aware of that. It's generally accepted that women presenting with symptoms of low self-esteem, depression, anxiety, or suspicious physical injuries or mental trauma should be screened for IPV. But also be on the lookout for indicators, including the presence of fear, the disclosure of a history of IPV in a previous relationship, if there's aggression or control in the current relationship, substance abuse, and also excessive anxiety about children. It's also really useful for you to know that direct questions about abuse rather than indirect questions about relationship quality are generally perceived as more helpful by clients. If she discloses after a direct question, of course, you don't have to formally screen, but if screening is indicated, there are several tools available to you, which I urge you to discuss in your workplace. And if you're already using them, I'd be really keen to hear how you think about using screening tools and what works and what doesn't, how you find it. Unfortunately, we're not all in the one place, so we can have sort of more fulsome discussions about those things. That the screening tool that I've recommended is on the screen there. One of our biggest concerns about screening is that disclosure can result in an inadequate or even in no response from the service provider. And this can be extremely harmful. In fact, it can cause or reinforce self-blame, and it reduces the likelihood that the woman's ever going to venture to seek support again. So what steps do you take if IPV is identified or disclosed? First, validate the disclosure, reaffirm that abusive behaviour is unacceptable and should never be excused, and that she's in no way to blame for it. It's not uncommon for women from refugee background to spontaneously start talking about the husband's stress and financial and work stress, maybe unemployment, as well as psychological effects from his past exposure to war. Now, these are all really valid issues and should be discussed with her, but never positioned as an excuse. Ensure that there's sufficient time and privacy to seek further information about the abuse and its impact on her. But if he's lurking around in the waiting room or standing outside, and the woman feels at all pressured, consider making another time in the near future to explore the abuse with her in more detail. But before letting her go that day, the woman must feel that her disclosure is being met by someone who recognises and understands the seriousness of it. I can't say that enough, and who's there to support her with whatever steps that she wants to take moving forward. And similarly, early after the disclosure on the same day, the counsellor needs to assess whether there's an imminent risk of serious harm to her or the children. And of course, if it's not safe, the counsellor needs to assist her to contact a domestic violence service, through one of the helplines. And if the children, of course, are at risk, you need to contact the relevant authority. Just a note on that though, many women fear that if you contact the authorities, if they've disclosed IPV, the children will be removed from them. And this actually happens way too often. It's a real fear. And often violent, abusive husbands use it as a threat to her not to say anything because she'll have the children removed. So it's really important that you are there to support her throughout that, and that you help her to stay in control of the situation as much as possible if you do have to report. It's really, really important. And that you're there to help her maintain her role as a mother. Make sure that the IPV service that you refer her to as well has counsellors who can speak the same language and understand the cultural and trauma factors that can make her situation more complex, because if they don't understand that, there's a problem, but also that can be leveraged to assist her, because there's many things in one's culture or religion that can be advantageous to help with the situation. So that's really important. Now, a key part of any intervention is to work with her to develop a safety plan to ensure that when she senses the situation's escalating or when she needs to escape quickly, she can do things like have ready access to emergency numbers. She can, maybe she's got secretly stored money, key documents. She's identified key support people and a place to stay should she need to exit quickly. There are safety planning guides online, and just make sure that the ones that you choose are culturally safe and relevant for her. It's also important to say that because refugee women often and refugee people generally fear the police or authorities, to reassure women that they can contact the police, that the police are trained and skilled to intervene to protect them if required. They shouldn't fear doing that. Remember that many women want to stop the violence. They want it to stop, but they don't want to leave the relationship. So you need to be aware of options for helping her to stay safe or cope within that context. So first of all, it's really important to be able to know if there's an avenue where you can refer the perpetrator to stop his abuse, services and supports, but also to be able to help with her to access the civil justice system to get a domestic violence order. In New South Wales, we call these apprehended domestic violence orders. And be aware, of course, of exclusion orders as well, which can help her to maintain, and stay in the home, and that prohibit the person from coming back to the home. And consider the realities and the importance of supporting her to take action in the criminal justice system, because IPV, like other forms of assault, is a crime. So you need to be aware that in most cases, it's not a linear path from disclosure to living free from abuse. And women often change direction many times throughout the period that you work with her. Everyone knows how complex personal relationships are. So, and when there's violence in there, it's even more complex. And when there's children in there, it's even more complex, and all the factors, family pressure and so on. So the predominant view is that the counsellor needs to prioritise the woman's autonomy. And these points I'm just making now about that. Always respect her ambivalence about whether to stay or leave the relationship, and consider all the factors that are impacting on her, such as cultural expectations for women and fear of reprisal and harm to her if she does leave. And that's very real, like economic loss and physical harm. Facilitate and support her to process her situation and her concerns and goals, but don't pressure her to make, to identify a solution too early. Just help her to clarify and evaluate, and think about ways to reach small and achievable goals. Physical and emotional safety, and just reiterate throughout the whole process all the time that the responsibility for violent behaviour rests solely with the perpetrator, the person using it. And it's really empowering to say to women, and you may think, oh, well, everyone knows this, but when you say this to women, it's often really empowering that this is actually a really common problem that lots of women experience intimate partner violence. She's not alone with it. Now, I just want to say that empowerment is interrelated with shifting blame by seeing the problem as related to men's abuse of power and gender inequality in relationships and societies. So discuss self-confidence and self-esteem issues, and let her know that IPV is particularly pernicious with respect to self-blame. You can talk about what it looks like to feel more assertive and start to gain emotional strength, and orient her to identifying and understanding her trauma-related symptoms and the impact they can have on confidence and agency. And you might also need to discuss parenting issues or post-parenting issues, and make sure she's fully supported, really important when she does make the step to leave, or if she does, and also if she needs to go to court. Court is daunting for any women to go to, all women, in relation to domestic violence, but particularly hard for people who don't have English as a first language. And you can, of course, you need to always think about grief issues, because there's a lot of grief and loss going on. Grief for the partner you thought you had, the relationship you thought and assumed you'd be in, and also the safety and security you thought you were going to have in Australia, and realise that there's just yet another, a lot of violence going on here in your own home. And a loss of separation, of course, from family back at home when you most need them. And, importance of stress management skills are really important. And referral for, common mental health conditions that you may wish to refer because of their severity, like PTSD or depression, anxiety disorders. And the really important point is don't attempt couple counselling. Couple counselling is not recommended where there's a power inequality or unilateral abuse. This, in fact, places the more vulnerable partner at risk and greatest risk of harm. In some cases, couples may actually come to you for support and you don't realise that there's abuse. They haven't disclosed it. So you need to be on the lookout. And if there's any indication of IPV, it's your responsibility to screen to make sure that there isn't domestic violence going on, and if there is, not to proceed with that dyadic from that. So I want to cover 3 modalities that have been adapted for working with victim survivors, and often, of course, counsellors, and you know this very well, draw from across multiple different frameworks. But this one, the first one, is feminist therapy. It's probably the most common. It emphasises raising consciousness around personal and relational power, and particularly challenging power that's understood as patriarchally based and oppressive. And it has as its core this underlying goal of empowering women, which I've been focusing on this evening. And it uses therapy processes to support greater awareness of social and structural issues. And counsellors also aim to promote an egalitarian relationship or environment with their clients and talk about the importance of relationships where power is shared. Strengths-based counselling, of course, aims to avoid pathologising clients and helps them to recognise their own resourcefulness and strengths and resilience, of which women who are experiencing domestic violence have many, and to identify solutions by thinking about through those strengths. And motivational interviewing, which is often used in the addictions field, has been applied to domestic violence, and it helps clients to examine the costs and benefits of not changing, of changing, and for reducing resistance and fear and ambivalence toward positive behavioural change. But remember that the change must align with the client's own values, otherwise it's not going to be very effective. I wanted to make a controversial point about CBT, which assumes in effect that individuals have faulty thinking and therefore they lack knowledge and skills to stabilise and change their own behaviour. And this really feeds into this women blaming scenario that we have to stop. So CBT is also quite problematic in cases where it's used to manage a situation that the client neither legally or ethically should be in the first place. So imagine if you use CBT, for example, to help a child being bullied at school without intervening to stop the bully or the situation that enables the bully. But on that other hand, CBT is not entirely without value. It can be applied as a type of psychoeducation in relation to identifying abusive dynamics and trauma and understanding the impacts, on beliefs and behaviours and emotions. And it can offer practical skills and problem solving as well, with the aim of increasing her likelihood of being able to, be able and empowered to leave the relationship or to take action. And group work is particularly effective with women who can benefit from not feeling so typically isolated and alone, and where they can explore commonly experienced issues safely and supportively in a group. And you can also do really fun activities with women, such as role-playing and drama around relationship inequalities. I actually love that. It's a lot of fun. So there's no doubt that working in the IP field is stressful and demanding for you. It's a very stressful area, it can be. And so self-care is important. And I know everyone says this, but it's true that you should take some time every day to think about what you've done to ensure your own well-being or your own, stress. Consider what you're doing to address your stress. But do whatever works for you. If someone says you have to meditate, not everyone finds meditation relaxing, but you can do anything: running, exercising, gardening, listening to music, dancing, cooking, whatever you like. It's just something that helps you to de-stress. But also, just practically, it's really important to have access to a good supervisor who's trauma-informed and aware about IPV. And this is easier said than done. I know there's a shortage of people so skilled in this field. And that's why we find it really important and to put a priority on growing a critical mass of experts in this area. And that, of course, might be you. So yell out if you're interested in this field. My last point in this presentation is that IPV is not an organic disease. It's not, you often, when you're reading about it, look out for that. It's often, in the health field anyway, and in the mental health field, seen as being like a disease or a disorder, but it's a preventable form of violence that's gendered, and it stems from inequalities and expectations of women in relationships. It's an exploitation of power in a relationship. And in effect, you're being an advocate for women and for the women that you work with. So a luta continua, the struggle continues, and thank you very much. Thanks.